AskRedd by Eggless Yoke. Serious, what dark family secret were you let in on once you were old enough? Attention, serious, tag notice. Jokes, puns, and off-topic comments are not permitted. https://www.reddit.com/r/wiki/index-wiki_rule_6 in any parent or child. Parent comments that aren't from the target group will be removed, along with their child replies. Report comments that violate these rules. Posts that have few relevant answers within the first hour, and posts that are not appropriate for the serious tag will be removed. Consider doing an AMA request instead. Thanks for your cooperation and enjoy the discussion. I am a bot, and this action was performed automatically. Please, contact the moderators of this subreddit. Message compose $r AskRedd if you have any questions or concerns. Why all stories are wild. Mine is super tame. When I was in my early 20s, I found an old photo of someone in a family album I didn't recognize. When I asked my mom about it, she said, "Oh, that's your Aunt Gloria." Then she lowered her voice, even though we were alone, and added, "She's a nudist, poor Aunt Gloria, just wants to be a nudie lady and everyone acts like she's a leper." I aspire to be a Gloria. I found out I had a sister who had been given up for adoption. The only reason I found out was the person who informed me no longer felt bound to secrecy after my mom died. And the person who told me had receipts solid enough that I have no reason to doubt them. It also explains why mom freaked out when I told her I'd done a 23andMe test. 23andMe is how my father discovered he had a bonus cousin. Turns out his uncle had a fling before leaving for WWII that resulted in a child he either never told anyone about or didn't even know himself. When my father looked her, the cousin, up, she happened to live in the same city. He and my aunts contacted her and all met up for lunch. Turns out the woman had been searching for years to find her father's side of family. As far as I know, they still keep in touch. My extremely wealthy uncle was going downhill quick with Alzheimer's. Before he was too far gone, he apparently made a deal with my aunt that when things got to the point that they would have to send him to a nursing home, she would kill him instead. He wrote all of this in a letter and gave it to the attorney of their estate. When the time came, I don't know why she chose to shoot him in the back of the head instead of something less violent, but she did. It was a pretty big trial with a fair bit of news coverage, and it really blew up when the lawyer testified and brought forward the letter. My aunt served like 2 years I think and was released on parole. That's extremely sad but also really badass of both of them. I'm sorry for everyone who was involved. My uncle was actually my cousin. He was kidnapped as an infant and when he was returned a year later, my aunt didn't want him back. My grandparents adopted him so he was legally my uncle. Kidnapped and then they didn't want him back, what the hell? Excuse me for asking, but was the kidnapping legit or was it set up to get rid of him? This is so sad. I found out when I was about 32 that apparently in 1973 my dad had a daughter he never knew existed. I found out because he texted that to me while I was working, after finding out about it himself about 1 week earlier. She was in her late 40s by that point, I think. What sort of tragic is all this time we thought I was my dad's only kid, and he always wanted a daughter but never got one due to marriage's ending. He would have fucking loved this girl. His daughter was the result of a one-night stand with a girl he never talked to again, and according to his daughter the mother had a mental breakdown not longer after giving birth and never really had custody of the daughter anyway. Dad never would have had any way to find out. The baby grew up with the mother's parents in another state, and the mother kinda went AWOL. My parents took me to Disneyland for my 7th birthday. I recall landing, going to the park, having a great first day or two. Then my parents had to step out and take a bunch of phone calls. They sounded very stressed. They kept telling me nothing happened and everything was okay. Eventually we flew home, and surprise, took an extra couple days to go to a big water park away from home. I fondly remembered this birthday and eventually forgot about any of the weirdness. Maybe 10 years later my parents finally told me what happened. My uncle, my dad's brother, tried to kill himself on my 7th birthday. He shot himself in the stomach with a rifle. He was poor, addicted to drugs, no work, etc. He felt depressed. My dad had a life he always wanted, so tried to kill himself. He ended up living. My parents took me to the water park so that we didn't have to come home to him leaving the hospital. By not telling me, my parents let me keep my birthday as my day, not the day uncle tried to die. Knowing how a 7-year-old's brain works, I probably would have thought I had something to do with it. Good on your parents. Is your uncle still around? My parents had 2 kids before I was born. My mother drowned them in a bathtub during a psychotic episode. Somehow, despite this and a prior history of mental illness, she got released and had me a couple years later. They had another child just before I turned 2, but I never laid eyes on her. Neither of them ever fessed up, though. I only found out about their existence after an aunt died and left me her personal effects. I found birth announcements for these other kids in her mementos. I always thought she meant for me to find them. When I asked my parents, they refused to discuss anything related to these kids. A few years later, I went back to my hometown and looked up that date in the newspaper morgue. The friend who went with me was flawed. I wasn't, really. I'd grown up in fear for my life from her ages. I broke off contact with them as soon as I could. Not just because of this, though it didn't help. I had a slew of my own traumas growing up. It was a huge mistake to let them try to raise another child. Wait, if you don't mind me asking, what do you mean I never laid eyes on her? What happened there? My older sister is not my full sister, she's my half sister via my mother. My mother was married before and had my sister with her first husband. Her first husband raped my sister from when she was 2 or 3 years old. My mother caught him assaulting my sister, but no one believed her and my sister was, from what I was told, fucked up. My mother divorced him and he tried to get custody of my sister, so she ran away with my sister, even cutting contact with her own family to keep my sister safe. A few years later she met my dad, who unofficially adopted my sister, and they had me. I grew up not knowing because my sister thought I might not love her the same if I knew we had different dads, and I think maybe some part of her wanted to forget her stepdad isn't really her biological dad. The only reason I ever found out when I was 20 is because somehow, my sister's biological grown mother found my mother's address and called. I answered the phone and she mistook me for my sister. That was an interesting phone call and afternoon. There's so many stories here of people just ignoring shit. Kudos to your mom for fighting and sacrificing to keep your sister safe. My uncle molested my mom. I don't understand how he is still welcome in the family. Familial sexual abuse is one of the most horrifying, damaging crimes, and it is also probably the most covered up, rug-swept crime. I will never understand it either. I found out when I was in my early 30s that my mom hadn't only had 4 kids, but actually 6, but gave 2 up for adoption before I was born. Also, I was the last baby she had with some rando before she married my stepdad, and she had intended to give me up for adoption, as well. Silver lining? One of the babies she gave up contacted her a few years after I learned about this, and now I have an awesome new brother. Found out about a half-sibling later in life too. He's nice and I felt oddly comfortable and familiar around him immediately. It's extremely unfortunate though the rest of my family wants nothing to do with him and are mad at me for reaching out at all. I only get met with anger or non-answers when I press the issue too. My parents and sibling have all gotten really weird in the decade or so this all unfolded. There's so much going, otherwise I don't think it's the main reason, but I feel like I'm not being told something about the situation I should know. My grandpa, 15, kidnapped my grandma, 14. From a convent. No one even bothered looking for her thereafter cause she was an orphan and didn't even know who her family was. They had 16 children together. It's extremely upsetting when you dig into many people's grandparents' great-grandparents' stories in my country because kidnapping young girls to marry them was considered normal. My grandfather had severely scarred legs from burns he got as a kid. Growing up we were told that he was in a fire in an apartment building and sustained the burns while escaping. He died when I was 7, and one of my few memories of him is an image of those scarred legs. Well, when I was 23, my great aunt, his sister, told me that it wasn't a fire. Their father ran a bath with scalding water and put my grandfather in it as a punishment. Great-grandfather was an abusive alcoholic piece of shit who fucking maimed his son. My mom poured boiling water on my legs when I was around 2. I have a small weird scar and some freckling where the scar is, but that's it at this point. I had a really shitty mom. Not terribly dark, but as an adult my dad told me he used to be a coke addict and quit shortly before I was conceived. It's interesting to look at now because he's pretty straight edge in his older years, doesn't even drink beer. Wonderful person though. My paternal grandmother had an affair with our small town's mortician in the 1940s. She got pregnant and he performed an illegal abortion. The fetus was buried behind the funeral home he owned where we kids used to sled every winter. My dad told me this as I was getting ready to take a ride down the hill on the sled when I was 12. Also, paternal grandfather had multiple illegitimate children around our small town. Turns out one of my best friends was also my half-cousin. Father told me when I was 17. My father was educated, intelligent, honest and moral. The fact that his parents were so wild was absolutely shocking to me. Or, so little kid you is trying to get some sledding in and you find out you're sledding over your loved one's secret grave. That's awful. It's nice your dad was straight up with you though. That my biological mother used to give me heroin and Valium as a baby and toddler to control me, then drop me off at my grandmother's house when she couldn't afford to share, so I'd go through withdrawals but no one would know what was wrong. Needless to say, I was put up for adoption to get me away from that. Jesus, I hope you're doing okay now. That my grandma didn't lose her leg to cancer, she lost it because she got injured helping my grandpa fix the roof, and my grandpa was too cheap to have it fixed properly, so he told the doctor to cut it off. Then he beat the crap out of her for life. I remember my mother lying on the couch in pain when I was a kid. My dad apparently would pay for her teeth repair and she had them all pulled at age 35, wore dentures until she passed at 96. That was cruel. I'm religious about my teeth getting fixed. When I was very young, my family lived in a townhouse, and against all local bylaws, my mother decided to keep the horse in our backyard. Not only that, but it was an ex-race horse that came as a package deal, the goat companion that slept in the closet of my nursery. I also later found out she was running a grow-op in the basement. This is so nice to read after all the other entries about child rape and murder. My uncle didn't die in a car accident. He killed his mistress and then killed himself by crashing his car with her body in the trunk. Dude, here's a family story I refer to as the accident. 4 years my older sister's bio dad died in her accident when she was 8. She didn't find out until she was a teenager that it wasn't a car accident, it was a painted the ceiling with his brain accident. Anyway, fast forward 30 some years and my sister deals with a fuckload of mental issues, and is constantly treating her children poorly. It's Easter Sunday and our younger sister is introducing her boyfriend to our family, and it's his first meal with us. Think modern Norman Rockwell style all out meal but with a bunch of kids and family. But my older sister won't stop yelling at her kids. My dad, who has been her only active father, finally snaps and tells her to knock it off. She, a 40-something-year-old woman, pulls the "you're not my dad" line like a shitty teenager. That man goes from calm to red, stood up, veins bulging from his head and absolutely screams, "Yeah! Your fucking child molester dad blew his fucking head off." He never had to deal with your bullshit. And that's how everyone in our family found out what the accident really was and why it happened. Not exactly dark, but I found out my father wrote porn novels under a pen name to make ends meet when I was a baby. I've been trying to find one ever since. Shame too, you might have been able to launch one of the most successful podcasts of all time if you had. I knew my grandfather was a coal miner, and that he was really involved with the union, but it wasn't till after he died that I found out just how much of a union man he was. If something needed blowing up or someone needed to not be breathing anymore, they called Gramps. After he died, my brother remembers some men coming to visit Gran and giving her a lot of envelopes. She took off for a year-long vacation in Europe after that. Edit. For all the people saying my Gramps was a great man, thank you for the kind thoughts, but seeing something you think is cool on Reddit is not the reality. He wasn't a good husband and he wasn't a great father to 3 of his daughters, although he loved my mama very much, as well as me and my brothers and cousins. Being a violent person for good reasons does not make you a good person. It just makes you a means to an end. That's my Kermantraut. My grandpa can't have kids, but my mother still has 3 siblings. The old Jonas Venture special. When my grandma's gentleman friend was admitted into a care home for his dementia, they had a problem in verifying his medical records. As he deteriorated, he lost his Irish accent and would occasionally speak in German. He was a child during WW2. My parents reckon he was probably a Jewish escapee. This happened to my great aunt. She was a German Jew and she got Alzheimer's. She forgot her husband, then forgot she wasn't trying to escape the Nazis, then forgot how to speak English and spoke in German thinking she was a teenager, then forgot how to speak, then died. Alzheimer's is not the best. I don't know about dark, but here goes. My great-grandfather murdered the mayor of the village he lived in. Why? Because the mayor was sleeping with his mom while his father worked on the field. I think he was 15 or 16 when he did that. Edit. You're wild here. When I said I don't know about dark, I meant compared to being related to serial killers, drugs, rapes and incest like some of the comments here. That's first. Second, what happened to the mom? Obviously, my great-grandfather was not this heartless, so he never told his father. He told my mom, that's my mom's grandfather, sorry I didn't specify, that he confessed to his mom on her deathbed what he did. I don't know about dark. Proceeds to tell story about infidelity and murder. My dad's side of the family has ties with the mafia. Thankfully my mom has long since divorced my dad and their life a decent distance apart. I heard stories of my mom's parents who lived close by at the time circling the block in their truck late at night soon after the divorce to ensure no one was there to hurt us. I was very young at this point, probably like 3-4, so I really have no memory of this. I do remember one night our garbage can was burned to the ground, and my mom has since told me about death threats soon after the divorce. My mom a couple years ago watched a documentary on prominent mafia families and noted multiple names that were at her wedding. I don't think my family was actually involved in the mafia, but my mom has told us several times that my great-grandfather ran a very successful laundromat, and also that a noted member of the mafia attended his funeral. My dad left when I was 7 and we were always told that it just didn't work out with my parents. We saw him off and on for about 2 years after he left, then never saw him again. He had remarried and she had a kid that became his stepson that my brother and I would hang with when we would go to my dad's house. Then when I turned 13 my mom finally told me that the stepson was actually his son from having an affair with that woman. So that kid was my half brother and I had no clue. Found out one of my close relatives was a trigger man for a crime family, was killed at his daughter's school functions. The problem with killing people for money is that you're inherently working for someone who is willing to solve problems with paid homicide. What happens when they decide you know too much? My great aunt's husband killed his first wife, then killed her. They lived in Puerto Rico and he fled to Nick so my great uncles wouldn't kill him. They found out where he was, came here, killed him, and went home. Edit, typo. Isn't it scary how succinct the explanation of things like this can be? I think this counts. My whole family found out at the same time about the dark secret. I was 25. My great-grandparents left their spouses for each other. Great-grandpa was 37 and great-grandma was 19 in Ireland. My GGPA had 7 children. My GGMA had 3. They left their spouses and children in the middle of the night to run away together and moved to America. Didn't say a word and never talked to them again. When my grandpa, their only child from their new life, would ask them about their past or family, they got really weird and would refuse to say anything. They took the secret to their graves. My grandpa at age 70 wanted an explanation about his heritage, so he signed up for Ancestry and 23andMe. Could you imagine how shocked he was to find out he had 10 siblings? They had been searching their whole lives to find out what happened to their parents. He got to meet them and would travel to visit them twice a year. My grandpa died 4 years ago. At least he got to know his siblings for a bit before he died. Happy, sad, and screwed up all at the same time. Disturbing. At least it ended good. Must have been very hard for all these children to wake up one day without one of their parents and no explanation. We'll also submit a light one here. The story of my grandma's real name. Let's say that my whole life I knew my grandmother's name to be Mary. Everyone called her this, everyone knew it. Once day when I was in my 20s I was with my grandmother and saw her sign some legal document. She signed it as Edith. I was horribly confused. I asked grandma about it and she said her name was Edith but it was never spoken and to not use it. She is in her 80s at this point. Apparently my great-grandfather had been an Air Force pilot stationed in the UK during WW1. He had a girlfriend at the time named Edith. After the war was over they broke up. Great-grandpa returned home and married great-grandma shortly after. They had only one child, a girl, whom he named Edith. Roughly 18 months later my great-grandmother saw a letter in the mail from an Edith and figured it out. She vowed the child would never be called the damn name ever again. She went by her middle name Mary, though it was never legally changed. My own mother states she did not know her own grandmother's name until she was 22. I have had fun randomly dropping this name bomb on cousins here and there and enjoying the shock and laughter about it. It's a silly secret that nowadays just makes people giggle. Great-grandma died from a botched abortion when she got pregnant a 7th time. I knew someone whose grandmother died trying to abort number 24 in Sicily in the 40s. Found out my dad's mom was a lesbian and that my godmother who lived with both my grandfather and grandmother was actually her lover. They slept in the same bed while my grandfather had his own room. Growing up I had no idea, but as I got older I pieced it together. But I loved them all and still do. R.I.P. My dad secretly had a vasectomy after I was born, after my mom lying to him about taking birth control resulted in my birth. Our family is great at communication and conflict resolution. Lol, I'm glad we all have screwed up histories. I found my half-sister when she was 25 because my nephew did the DNA test on Ancestry.com. We pulled my dad aside to tell him what we discovered and he replied with "That's the biggest secret that I've kept for 25 years. He was banging her married mom and got pregnant. She always felt different as she was really petite, tan skin and curly hair. None of which was in her family. Meeting her was like looking through a mirror into my childhood. She's my twin." My grandfather didn't pass from a heart attack due to old age. He killed himself. I found out a few months after he died that my grandfather killed himself with a couple of nails from a nail gun to the temple. I was 25, but it still wigs me out to think about it. I wasn't let in on it, so to speak. My dad is Polish and I took a DNA test, turns out I'm 100%. Not polish. I look exactly like my dad. My dad looks nothing like his father. There is a somewhat famous story about this. An Irish mother gave birth at a hospital to a son. The mother died while young and the son grew up as effectively an orphan due to his father not being able to support him. Kind of made being Irish part of his identity. After he was dead, his daughter took a DNA test to discover she was half Jewish. So were her siblings. Her mother wasn't Jewish. And her dad was supposedly 100% Irish. They finally figured it out when one of her Irish cousins took a DNA test that matched to a Jewish family who discovered they were half Irish. Their dad was born at the same hospital on the same day as her dad. The hospital had accidentally mixed up the babies after birth. I wasn't let in on it, more like I found out about it, but my siblings have a different dad than I do. That was common knowledge and not the secret at all. The secret was that their dad actually didn't die in the hospital of a terminal illness. He died of suicide when he threw himself from the window of the hospital he was slowly dying in. I always thought my two older brothers got addicted to drugs because of their own decisions and the people they hung out with. It turns out that my dad had been feeding them pills since they were about 10 to shut them up. Years I held resentment against them for not being good older brothers like they should have, only to find out that it was my father who I had praised all those years that was truly evil. Edit. Wow, wasn't expecting all of this lol. Just to address some of the comments, my brothers are doing mostly fine now. Both struggled but eventually found sobriety. Luckily enough, family didn't give up on them. We have a pretty good relationship now and none of us hold anything against each other. We realize that none of us are to blame for the sins of our father. Not sure where dad is, no contact for about a decade now. In contrast, mom was and still is an angel. With her showing me who to be and my dad showing me exactly who not to be, I think I turned out pretty okay. A lot of the time the cycle just continues, but my brothers and I managed to break it. I'm sorry to everyone who has gone through something similar. Thank you for sharing your stories as well. Hope everyone finds their peace someday. Love you. Wow, that really is dark. How are your brothers doing now? Edit. Typo. Not super dark or super secret, but when I had to do a project on my family tree in elementary school, one of the questions was, when did your family immigrate to America and why? For one of my great grandfathers, my grandma told me life was very hard back in his country, and it was getting dangerous to stay there, and for a long time I thought, yeah, I can see that. It was probably hard for a teenager living in Poland with WWI right around the corner. And I'm sure it was. But it turns out it's even harder and more dangerous when you're a teenager who has slept with a married woman and then accidentally killed her husband when he confronted you. I can see why she didn't want me to put that on my elementary school project. Edit. Wrong World War. I just pulled up his Ellis Island records and he immigrated in 1912 aboard the Carpathia in August. This makes me wonder how many of those projects are basically lies. I bet many parents don't want their kids saying some shit like, well, after my grandma's sister was beheaded, they decided to pack up and come here. My grandmother married her second husband entirely for money. Her daughters both like to joke about her intentionally giving him a heart attack. He had heart problems but liked to eat unhealthy food, and the rumor goes she would put extra salt and butter on his food until he finally kicked the bucket. Here's a dark secret I am keeping myself. My late Phil pretty much did this to himself. My partner knows Phil stopped doing his prescribed walking and ate lots of fast food after Mill died. That was too obvious to hide, since we went to live with him for a while. What I kept to myself were the multiple unopened bottles of Xarelto I found when we were clearing out that house. Also another one I've forgotten the name of. Presumably, he kept refilling the scripts so his doctor wouldn't catch on. But then he chucked them in a drawer and only took them when we came to visit. He died emotionally when Mill passed on. They'd been genuinely devoted to each other and she was his world. It took 16 months for his body to catch up. He had a massive stroke and died a day or so later. My great-grandmother was shot dead in the street by an ex-boyfriend, in front of my 4-year-old grandma and her 2 younger brothers. It happened in a really quiet European town and I believe it made the papers. Grandma ended up being sent to live with an aunt and the boys stayed with their father and he remarried a nasty abusive woman. I didn't know this until I was 18. From the older boy actually, Uncle Jay, but hearing this story really changed my perspective on grandma and the boys. The boys both ended up going to prison and having difficult lives, and grandma was a stern, unemotional woman. I feel like this gave me some understanding as to why. I was told by my aunt, before my parents thought it necessary, that my dad had cheated on my mum and slept with a stripper and that I was her daughter and not actually my mother's. I found out years later that my dad wasn't actually my dad either, though he thought he was, which is why he put his name on my birth certificate and brought me home when my birth mother wanted nothing to do with me. Fun times. So, you are not biologically related to either of your parents? Just found this one out recently. My uncle was a doctor working in a small town hospital. He was married and had just had a baby boy. While his wife was pregnant or just had the baby, he had an affair with 2 nurses in the hospital and ended up getting one of the nurses pregnant. When he found out of the second kid, he took his family and fucked off to New Zealand for 3 years. Upon returning to Canada in the same small town hospital, his wife immediately found out about his illegitimate child and divorced him. My illegitimate cousin stopped coming around to family events, and when I talked to him about it last year, he told me that my grandparents always blamed him for ruining my uncle's marriage. I love that grown adults will blame a child for existing. My uncle raped his own younger sister for years and nothing was really done about it. How awful. My mom's cousin, my second cousin, molested her growing up multiple times. She was apparently getting molested herself by her brother ? I think. Later on, that cousin got married to a guy who went on to molest their daughter they had together. Came out later he was keeping a treasure trove of child pornography in the house, with bits of their daughter included in that. He was busted by the police, which ended in a shootout in some random business building, made the news and everything. He got shot and died during this whole ordeal. They're probably the 2 most fucked up individuals I've ever known. My grandpa's stepdad's side, first wife tried to murder him, and went to prison for it. Then also, my aunt, mom's side, was pimped out by her husband for decades. A family member walked in on my mother breaking my arm by holding me only by it when I was 2. Didn't say anything for fear of breaking up. A family mother abused me my whole life and even after cutting contact 3 years ago is still trying to ruin my life. This family member told me the story casually and acted as if they'd done me a favor because I could have ended up in care. Had to pull back from all of them now because of the realization they were all bystanders and let it go on without a word. This might be a bit too weird for this thread. I am from a country still enshrined in a lot of superstition and religion. My great-great-grandmother was a crazy woman who practiced witchcraft. One day her husband died unnaturally. He was murdered or something by the village, and Granny went mad. She gathered the village folk around and picked up a rock from the ground nearby and declared that the rock will be her curse and the village will suffer for killing her husband. After that she killed herself. For multiple generations my family worshipped the rock as a deity and prayed to lift the curse from the village. It ended when my father in his 20s got sick of his family doing stupid shit.